It takes a special kind of stupid to try and tow a $250,000 mobile command center. It takes a special kind of evil to do it with a smile. Her name, as you might have guessed, was Karen, and she was about to learn the difference between a rule book and a playbook. My playbook. Saturday. The holy day of rest. For most folks in Serenity Meadows, that meant sleeping in, maybe hitting the farmer's market for some aggressively priced organic kale, or polishing their identical HOA-approved mailboxes. For me, Saturday meant a sacred ritual. Preventative maintenance. My company, Gable Utility Solutions, is the 4th emergency service. When a water main decides to cosplay as the Old Faithful geyser in the middle of a mall parking lot at 3 a.m., we're the guys who get the call. Our official motto is, "Your worst day is our work day." My unofficial motto is, "Don't break my stuff." For our motto to hold true, my gear has to be less than perfect and more than bulletproof. And the heart of all my gear, the queen of my fleet, was Bertha. Bertha wasn't just a truck. She was a custom-built Ford F-550, a $250,000 masterpiece of diesel-powered problem-solving. She had a hydraulic crane that could lift a small car, welders that could stitch steel back together, and enough diagnostic equipment to tell you the life story of a faulty sewage pipe. She was my office, my toolbox, and my pride and joy, and she was currently parked on the street directly in front of my house. I was in the garage, a place of glorious, organized chaos, wrestling with a new high-pressure water pump. It was a beautiful piece of Italian engineering that promised to blast through root blockages like a laser through butter, but the fittings were metric. Of course they were. I was covered in a light sheen of hydraulic fluid, humming along to some classic rock, when I realized I needed a very specific 17 mm flare nut wrench. I knew exactly where it was. Bertha, driver's side, 3rd drawer down, snug in its foam cutout. Wiping my greasy hands on a rag that had seen better decades, I walked out of my garage and into the bright, unforgiving Saturday morning sunlight. And then I froze. The sight that greeted me was so profoundly offensive, so fundamentally wrong, that my brain took a second to process it. A hulking, greasy tow truck, the kind that looks like it feeds on misfortune, was backed up to Bertha's gleaming chrome bumper. The tow hook, a nasty rusted claw of metal, was already latched on. And there, standing on the pristine sidewalk, observing the operation with the smug, triumphant satisfaction of a cat watching a cornered mouse, was Karen Pinter. She held a clipboard like a scepter and wore a visor that perfectly shaded her perpetually disappointed face. Karen was the newly elected president of the Serenity Meadows Homeowners Association, a position she'd campaigned for with the rabid fervor of a revolutionary trying to overthrow a dictator. The previous HOA president, a mild-mannered accountant named Phil, had allowed a resident to plant pansies instead of the mandated petunias. Phil was driven from office in disgrace. Karen was his replacement, the iron-fisted guardian of beige conformity. "Hey!" I shouted, my voice louder than I intended. I started jogging towards them, a greasy, sweatshirt-wearing barbarian crashing her pristine suburban tableau. "Hold on, hold on! What do you think you're doing? That's my truck!" Karen didn't even deign to look at me. She addressed the tow truck driver, a mountain of a man with an expression of deep, cosmic weariness. "Proceed with the removal. The violation is confirmed." "The hell it is," I said, getting closer. "That's my truck, and you're not taking it anywhere." The driver, whose name tag read Sal, paused and looked from me to Karen. He had the eyes of a man who had seen far too many of these little neighborhood disputes. Karen finally turned to face me. Her eyes were small and hard, like 2 little bits of gravel. "Are you Franklin Gable of 124 Lilac Lane?" she asked, her voice crisp and devoid of any human warmth. "You know damn well who I am, Karen. We talked for 20 minutes at the potluck last month about mulch. What is this?" She tapped her clipboard with a perfectly manicured finger. "This is enforcement of the Serenity Meadows covenants, conditions, and restrictions. Specifically, Article 4, Section 2, Subsection B. No commercial vehicle, trailer, or mobile equipment shall be parked on any street or in any driveway within the community for a period exceeding 4 hours." I stared at her, then at my truck, then back at her. 4 hours? It's Saturday morning. I've been working in my garage for an hour, maybe an hour and a half at the absolute most. I was just coming out to get a single wrench. Sal, the driver, grunted. "Lady, he says it's only been an hour. My paperwork says you confirmed the violation." Karen's lips tightened into a thin, bloodless line. She was enjoying this. "I have a time-stamped photograph from 7:58 a.m., provided by a concerned neighbor. It is now 9:15 a.m. That is, well, it's long enough to establish a pattern. The rule is the rule, Franklin. We cannot have these industrial eyesores degrading the aesthetic harmony of the neighborhood." The words hit a nerve. A deep, vibrating, very angry nerve. "Eyesore?" I sputtered, my voice rising. "That is a state-of-the-art mobile command unit. It's cleaner than your Prius and probably worth more than your house." "No offense, Sal." Sal shrugged, a gesture that conveyed a universe of non-involvement. "None taken, pal. I get paid either way. The ticket's signed." "Karen, be reasonable," I tried, shifting tactics from anger to desperate pleading. "I'll move it right now. I'll put it in the garage. It'll take me 2 minutes. Just have him unhook it." "The process is already in motion," she said, the words sounding rehearsed and final. She savored them. "The violation has been logged. The tow has been authorized by me on behalf of the association. If you want your vehicle back, you can retrieve it from O'Malley's impound down on the industrial park. I'd suggest you consult your handbook for the associated fees and fines. Have a serene day." She gave a curt, dismissive nod to Sal. The tow truck's engine revved, the hydraulics whined, and Bertha's front wheels lifted sickeningly off the ground. My truck, my beautiful, powerful, meticulously organized Bertha, was being kidnapped. I watched it happen, a strange calm washing over me. The anger was still there, simmering below the surface, but it was being replaced by something else. Clarity. A cold, calculating, logistical clarity. Karen Pinter had just started a war. She thought it was about parking. She thought she'd won by citing a rule. She had no idea that I was a man who solved problems for a living. And she had just become a very big, very annoying problem. She wanted to make this commercial. Fine, let's do business. The tow truck rumbled away, dragging Bertha behind it like a prisoner of war. Karen stood there for a moment, a smug little smile playing on her lips, before turning and walking back towards her own, perfectly manicured house. I looked at my watch. It was 9:17 a.m. 2 minutes. It took her less than 2 minutes to go from neighbor to nemesis. I pulled out my phone, my thumb hovering over the contact for Gary, my long-suffering, hyper-competent operations manager. A slow, dangerous grin spread across my face. It wasn't a happy grin. It was the kind of grin a structural engineer gets when he finds a fatal flaw in a blueprint. "You want to see a commercial vehicle, Karen?" I thought. "I'll show you a commercial fleet." I hit the call button. "Gary," I said, my voice calm and even. "How's your golf game this morning?" "Frank, I'm on the 3rd hole. Slicing it into the woods as usual. What's up? Don't tell me the Henderson Mall project went south." "Nope, Henderson Mall is fine," I said, my eyes fixed on Karen's front door. "I've got a different kind of emergency, a real one, a priority 1 situation developing at my house. There was a pause. I could hear the faint sound of birds chirping on his end. What kind of situation? Is it a sinkhole? Gas line? Worse, I said gravely. It's an HOA situation. I need the fleet. The fleet? What, you need a van? No, Gary, I said, the grin widening. I need the entire fleet. I want the Vominator. I want both of the high rollers. I want the groundhog and the directional drill. I want all 3 utility vans. And Gary Ray, I want you to wake up the beast. The silence on the other end of the line was profound. I could practically hear him processing the request. The beast was our crown jewel, a monstrous international CV series truck we brought in for catastrophic failures, a rolling disaster command center with more lights than a Vegas casino and its own satellite uplink. It hadn't been deployed in 6 months. Frank, are you okay? Gary finally asked, his voice laced with genuine concern. Never better, I replied. Also, call our best independent guys. Dave's dependable drains, Sparky's electric, Pete's perfect pipes. Tell them it's a top priority emergency job. Billable, of course, generous rates. What's the job, Frank? What do I tell them we're doing? I looked up and down the quiet, peaceful expanse of Lilac Lane. Tell them, I said slowly, that we are conducting a comprehensive, top-to-bottom public works infrastructure crisis assessment. And Gary, tell them to park everywhere. For the next 30 minutes, Serenity Meadows remained deceptively serene. A few of my neighbors were out mowing their lawns, the drone of the engines a familiar weekend soundtrack. My next-door neighbor, Bob, a retired Vietnam vet with a permanent chip on his shoulder regarding the HOA, was meticulously tending to his rose bushes. Karen Pinter was likely inside her beige palace, sipping a self-satisfied latte and updating her violation spreadsheet, blissfully unaware of the storm she had summoned. Then came the rumble. It started as a low, deep thrum in the distance, a vibration you felt in your teeth more than you heard with your ears. It wasn't the sound of a single engine. It was a symphony of them, a heavy, diesel-fueled orchestra tuning up for a very loud performance. The lawnmowers sputtered out one by one as their owners looked up, shielding their eyes against the sun, searching for the source of the growing thunder. Bob stopped trimming his roses, a curious smile spreading across his weathered face. He knew my business. He knew the sounds of my trucks. But he'd never heard anything like this. The first vehicle to turn onto Lilac Lane was the Groundhog. It was our biggest hydro excavator, a bright white and chrome behemoth that looked like a science fiction tank. It was designed to blast Earth away with high-pressure waters and suck up the slurry, and it moved with the ponderous grace of a dinosaur. The driver gave a blast from the air horn, a deep, resonant bray-ap that rattled the decorative shutters on Karen's house, before parking with a final, definitive hiss of its air brakes directly across the street from her driveway. And then the floodgates opened. It was a parade. A slow, majestic, and utterly terrifying parade of industrial might. The 2 bucket trucks, which the crew had nicknamed the High Rollers, came next. Their massive booms folded but still towering over the 2-story houses like skeletal giraffes. They took up positions on either side of the Groundhog. Then came the Vominator, our gleaming, colossal vacuum truck. Its sole purpose was to clear catastrophic sewer main blockages, and it looked the part. It was essentially a 3,000-gallon silver tank on wheels, and it parked right next to the excavator, its chrome shining malevolently in the sun. A flatbed arrived carrying our directional drilling rig, which looked disturbingly like a mobile missile launcher. It was followed by our 3 fully stocked Ford Transit utility vans, which filtered into the remaining curbside spots like pilot fish schooling around sharks. Another flatbed dropped off a mini excavator, its little yellow arm giving it the look of a petulant metal toddler. The grand finale, the crescendo of my mechanical orchestra, was the Beast. She was a monstrous International CV Series truck, a custom job that made Bertha look like a pickup. The Beast was our rolling command center for major disasters, black and chrome, covered in antennas, floodlights, and enough strobing LEDs to trigger an epileptic fit from 3 towns over. The driver, a guy named Marco, who loved the Beast more than his own children, navigated it with surgical precision into the exact spot on the curb where Bertha had been stolen from. With a final, deafening blast of its air horn and a long, drawn-out psh of its brakes, the deployment was complete. As if on cue, the contractors began to arrive. White vans with colorful logos started pulling up, each one finding a spot. Dave's Dependable Drains, Sparky's Electric, Pete's Perfect Pipes, Enzo's Masonry. Within 20 minutes, Lilac Lane had been transformed. It no longer looked like a suburban street. It looked like the staging area for a major disaster recovery effort. It looked like the end of the world. Jaws dropped, lawnmowers were abandoned mid-stripe. People came out of their houses, staring in silent disbelief. There was a potent mix of horror, confusion, and, for a select few, pure, unadulterated glee. Bob was no longer smiling. He was leaning against his controversial flagpole, practically crying with laughter. The front door of 122 Lilac Lane flew open, and Karen Pinter stormed out. Her face was the color of a ripe tomato, and her perfectly coiffed hair seemed to be vibrating with incandescent rage. "What is the meaning of this?" she shrieked, her voice cracking. "Are you insane? You can't do this. This is a residential area." I had changed into a clean pair of jeans and a Gable Utility Solutions polo shirt. I was leaning against the fender of the Beast, holding my own clipboard and sipping from a thermos of coffee. I took a slow, deliberate sip before answering. "Morning again, Karen," I said calmly. "Just taking your advice from earlier. I was rereading the HOA handbook. It's a real page-turner. Got me thinking about overall community safety and our civic responsibilities. So I've convened an emergency infrastructure audit." "An audit? This is harassment. It's intimidation. I'm calling the police." "Please do," I said, gesturing expansively with my thermos. "They should definitely be made aware of the potential liabilities we're investigating here. Public safety is a team effort, after all." She did call the police. 10 minutes later, a squad car rolled slowly down the street, its occupants staring at the mechanical army we had assembled. 2 officers got out. The older one, whose name tag read Miller, had the deeply weary look of a man who was 2 years from retirement and had seen everything twice. His younger partner, Davis, was failing miserably at hiding a smile. "Okay," Miller said, his voice a gravelly sigh as he took in the scene. He looked from the trucks to me, then to Karen, who was practically vibrating next to him. "Someone want to tell me what's going on here? And please, talk slowly, use small words." "Officer, thank heavens!" Karen exclaimed, rushing forward. This maniac is terrorizing the neighborhood. He's parked this army in our street as retaliation. Arrest him!" I pushed myself off the Beast and walked over, my clipboard held ready. I adopted my most serious professional tone, the one I used with city engineers and panicked mayors. "Officers Frank Gable, Gable Utility Solutions, were on the scene to investigate a suspected public works emergency." Davis finally spoke, his lip twitching. "A public works emergency? What kind of emergency?" "Based on initial reports," I said gravely, "we have reason to believe there's a potential for imminent failure in the subterranean sewage and water systems on this block. There are also indications of potential electrical grid instability." Miller stared at me, his expression flat. "What reports?" "My reports," I said, tapping my clipboard. As a licensed and bonded utility contractor with over 15 years of experience in catastrophic infrastructure failure, I've self-reported a potential critical situation. Given the age of some of these homes, I couldn't, in good conscience, do nothing and risk a sanitary sewer overflow or, heaven forbid, an electrical fire. So I deployed my emergency response team to assess the situation. It's a pro bono assessment, of course, for the good of the community. Miller rubbed his temples, a long, slow, circular motion. Sir, with all due respect, you can't just declare a city block an emergency zone. I'm not, I countered smoothly. I haven't blocked the road or ordered an evacuation. I'm simply conducting a preliminary, non-invasive survey from legally parked positions. My crews are on standby in case we need to, dig, which hopefully we won't, for the sake of the lovely petunias. I gestured towards Karen's prize-winning flower bed, which now sat in the shadow of the vominator. The cops were stuck, and they knew it. It was a beautiful moment of legal and bureaucratic paralysis. My vehicles were all taxed, insured, and legally parked. I wasn't breaking any laws yet. I was just there, with a lot of very large, very loud friends. Sir, Miller said, his voice tight with frustration, you are walking a very, very fine line. The finest, officer, I agreed with a nod. They spent another 10 minutes talking to Karen, who was becoming increasingly shrill. Finally, Miller threw his hands up. He turned back to me. Don't break anything. Then he turned to Karen. Ma'am, he's not technically breaking any laws. He then addressed the neighborhood at large. Everybody just keep the peace. They got back in their car and drove away. Their departure was a tactical victory, and a cheer went up from Bob's porch, where he had now been joined by 2 other neighbors, all of them holding beers and wearing massive grins. Karen stared at me, her face a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. The war had moved into its next phase. I clicked the pen on my clipboard. All right, boys, I called out to my assembled crew, who had been watching the drama with professional amusement. Let's get to work. Phase 1 of the audit is a go. Let's see what this neighborhood is made of. We weren't just going to let the trucks sit there. That would be crude. No, we were going to conduct the most comprehensive, meticulous, and utterly pointless safety audit in the history of suburbia. It was time for Operation Aggressive Assessment. My guys, loyal to a fault, and all in on the joke, sprang into action. This was better than any company picnic. They donned their hard hats and high-vis vests, transforming from a parked army into an active work crew. The performance was about to begin. First, the survey teams. 2 of my best guys, Marco and Danny, broke out the ground-penetrating radar unit, or what looked like a GPR unit. It was actually a commercial floor buffer I'd bought at an auction, onto which my head mechanic had gleefully bolted a satellite dish from an old RV and a flashing yellow light. They began meticulously scanning the pristine lawns, starting with the one directly across from Karen's house. "Whoa, I've got something here, boss!" Marco would yell, staring intently at the screen of a disconnected iPad he was carrying. I'd stroll over, clipboard in hand, and peer at the blank screen with a look of intense concentration. Looks like a significant subterranean void, Marco. Could be soil erosion. Could be a sinkhole. Mark it." Danny would then solemnly plant a small yellow flag in the grass. Within an hour, the lawns of Karen's closest allies were dotted with dozens of these little flags, indicating a terrifying network of invisible, non-existent dangers lurking just beneath the surface. Next up was the plumbing crew, led by Dave from Dave's Dependable Drains. Dave was a grizzled man with a twinkle in his eye who had seen more strange things in sewer pipes than most people see in their lives. "Dave, good to see you," I said, shaking his hand. "I need a comprehensive survey of the storm drain situation on this block. I'm talking flow rates, potential blockages, structural integrity, the works. Spare no expense. Dave chewed on his unlit cigar for a moment. Frank, they put these drains in 3 years ago when they repaved. They're cleaner than my church shoes. Are they, Dave? I asked, raising an eyebrow. Are they really? Mrs. Pinter over there at number 122 seems to think this neighborhood has certain standards. I want to ensure those standards are met from the ground up, literally. So, get your sewer cameras out. I want a full-color, high-definition documentary of every inch of that pipe. Look for anything. A crack. A suspicious clump of leaves. Anything. Dave grinned. You got it, boss. We'll make a feature film. Soon, his crew was lowering a high-tech camera on a long fiber-optic cable into the storm drain at the end of the street. They set up a laptop on a folding table and watched the live feed with the intense concentration of bomb disposal experts, occasionally pointing at the screen and muttering things like, "Did you see that? Looked like a stress fracture." Meanwhile, Sparky's Electric was on the case of the electrical grid instability. Sparky himself, a wiry man who ran on coffee and sarcasm, was my go-to for anything that could shock you. Sparky, what's the verdict on that transformer? I asked, pointing to the green metal box on the corner of Karen's lawn. Sparky had a sophisticated-looking diagnostic tool pressed against it. The tool was actually a stud finder with a bunch of extra wires glued to it. Well, Frank, he said in a low, serious voice, it's transforming. The volts are going in one side, and they're coming out the other side at a different number. It's a real miracle of science, but the harmonic resonance, it's a little off. I think I'll need to observe it for a few more hours to be sure. Wouldn't want it to, stop transforming. Good call. I nodded gravely. Take all the time you need. Safety is our #1 priority. The beauty of the operation was in the calculated, maddeningly precise inconveniences, all aimed squarely at one address. The ballet of malicious compliance was a sight to behold. The first movement was the bucket truck. One of the high rollers needed to perform a full horizontal boom extension diagnostic, a test I had just invented. The massive boom began to unfold, slowly, gracefully, extending out over the street until it was hovering directly over Karen's driveway. It didn't touch her precious Prius. It just sat there, about 15 feet above it, a multi-ton steel chaperone making it utterly impossible for her to get her car out. The operator, a kid named Leo, gave her a thumbs up and a winning smile from the control panel. When she stormed out to scream at him, he apologized profusely, explaining that the computer had initiated a mandatory 90-minute safety calibration cycle, and his hands were tied. The second movement was the water pressure test. My crew hooked up a complex-looking manifold of pipes and gauges to the fire hydrant down the street. To get an accurate baseline reading, we needed to isolate a small section of the main. This required shutting off the water to a test zone, which, through a series of unfortunate coincidences, consisted of exactly one house, 122 Lilac Lane. The first shutoff happened right around 11:30 a.m., likely just as Karen was thinking about lunch. The water was off for a diagnostic window of exactly 20 minutes, then restored. An hour later, it happened again, and again in the afternoon. Each time my guys would document the pressure drop with furrowed brows and serious note-taking. The third movement was a symphony of air. The Vominator, our giant vacuum truck, needed to purge its primary filtration system to prevent cross-contamination of atmospheric particulates. This involved a loud 10-second blast of compressed air from its exhaust port. It was completely harmless, but the truck just happened to be angled perfectly. The gust of wind was a localized hurricane, picking up every dry leaf, grass clipping, and stray piece of mulch from 3 adjacent lawns and depositing it all in a neat, insulting pile on top of Karen's award-winning, perfectly manicured rose bushes. She came out and just stared at the mountain of debris, her face twitching, completely lost for words. Lilac Lane was no longer a community. It was a theater of war with clearly defined sides. Team Frank was headquartered on Bob's front porch. He had dragged out a faded patio umbrella and set up a cooler full of sodas and water, which he offered freely to the brave boys on the front line. He was joined by Mrs. Gable from 4 doors down, who had once been fined by Karen for having a non-standard welcome mat, and the Henderson family, who were still bitter about being denied permission to build a treehouse for their kids. They sat in lawn chairs, providing a running commentary and occasionally breaking into applause for a particularly well-executed piece of performative maintenance. Team Karen was smaller, but more vocal. It consisted of her silent husband, Gerald, who would occasionally peer out from behind their curtains like a hostage, and the Higgins couple from across the street. Mrs. Higgins was the concerned neighbor who had taken the photo of Bertha. They spent the day marching up and down the sidewalk, filming everything on their iPads, their voices shrill as they shrieked about property values and flagrant violations. They made endless, futile calls to the city, the police, the mayor's office, and, I suspect, the United Nations. But I knew this delightful chaos couldn't last forever. I needed a checkmate. I needed an endgame. I had already set the pieces in motion with a call to my lawyer, a shark named Marissa, who cackled with undisguised glee when I laid out the situation. She gave me a beautiful, simple, and diabolical plan. It all came down to a crack in the sidewalk. I found Enzo from Enzo's Masonry, a quiet old-timer who had been enjoying a coffee in the cab of his truck. "Enzo, my friend, I have a critical job for you," I said, leading him to the sidewalk in front of my own house. "See this? This hairline crack? Right here on the property line?" Enzo squinted. "The little one? You could fill it with a tube of caulk from the hardware store, Frank." No, I said. "This isn't a crack, Enzo. This is an emergency structural failure. A clear and present public trip hazard. A lawsuit waiting to happen. I need you to perform an emergency public safety repair. I want you to document it with photos, before and after. Then, I want you to write up an invoice for Emergency Public Safety Services Rendered. Make it for, say, $500, for your time, your expertise, and your hazard pay. And I want you to send that bill directly to the Serenity Meadows Homeowners Association." A slow, wise grin spread across Enzo's wrinkled face. He understood completely. "I'll use my best chisels," he said. The day wore on, a long, sun-drenched afternoon of controlled chaos. As the sun began to dip lower in the sky, Karen, pushed to her absolute limit by the blocked driveway, the intermittent water, and the leafy mountain on her roses, finally made her fatal error. She stormed out of her house, her face a thundercloud. She saw one of my youngest crew members, a kid named Timmy who couldn't be more than 19, sitting on the curb drinking a Gatorade and waiting for instructions. "You!" she screeched, pointing a trembling finger at him. "You can't just sit there. This isn't a park. You're loitering." Timmy, startled, just looked at her. "I'm on my break, ma'am." That was it. That was the final straw for Karen's sanity. In a fit of pure, unthinking rage, she bent down, grabbed a gray, decorative landscaping rock from the border of her garden, a rock that was specifically listed in the HOA guidebook as Sedona River Rock, 4 6-inch diameter, and she hurled it. The rock sailed through the air and clanged loudly, if harmlessly, off the massive rear tire of the Vominator. It was a minor act of aggression, but it was also assault. And more importantly, Bob, from his command post on the porch, had been filming the entire exchange on his phone. I walked over, my face a mask of disappointment. "Karen, Karen, Karen," I said, shaking my head slowly. "We're just trying to keep the community safe." She stared at me, the rock still in her hand, her chest heaving. She had just handed me the smoking gun, and I knew exactly where to fire it. The emergency HOA meeting was going to be one for the ages. Karen, bless her vindictive little heart, called the meeting herself. She was a woman on a mission, armed with what she believed was an ironclad case of harassment and intimidation. An email went out to all residents of Serenity Meadows announcing an emergency HOA meeting at the community clubhouse that evening to address the unprecedented crisis on Lilac Lane. Her goal was clear: to have me fined into oblivion, hit with a lawsuit, and possibly exiled from the neighborhood like a modern-day leper. She probably had visions of a public shaming ceremony. I received the email and smiled. It was showtime. I didn't go alone. That would have been poor strategy. I rallied the troops. When I walked into that clubhouse at 7:30 p.m., I was flanked. I brought Gary, my ops manager, looking deeply uncomfortable in a collared shirt. I brought Bob, my neighbor, who wore his Vietnam veteran cap and a look of grim determination. I brought Sparky, Dave, and Enzo the Mason. And for backup, I brought a dozen of my crew members, the same guys who had been performing the day's symphony of chaos. They had all changed into clean Gable Utility Solutions polo shirts. We were a sea of coordinated navy blue. We didn't say a word. We just filed into the back half of the room, took our seats, and waited. The air in the room, which was usually filled with stale coffee and petty grievances, was suddenly thick with tension. Karen and the remaining members of the HOA board were seated at a long table at the front. She had a laptop hooked up to a projector and a PowerPoint presentation queued up. The title slide, in an aggressive red font, read, "The Siege of Lilac Lane, a stand against neighborhood terrorism." She began her presentation, her voice trembling with a mixture of rage and righteous fury. She clicked through her slides one after another. There were pictures of my trucks, zoomed in to make them look as menacing as possible. There were pictures of my men loitering, drinking water on a hot day. There were close-ups of the yellow flags on the lawns, the chalk marks on the pavement, the leaves on her roses. She spoke of the unbearable noise, the calculated disruption, and her profound emotional distress. And this flagrant, thuggish disregard for our community's bylaws is unacceptable, she declared, her voice rising to a crescendo. This was not a safety check. This was a calculated act of intimidation and commercial warfare by a man who thinks the rules that bind us all together as a community, do not apply to him. He has single-handedly lowered our property values and created a hostile, unlivable environment. She sat down to a smattering of applause from her few remaining allies. The HOA vice president, a nervous-looking man named Gerald, not her husband, a different Gerald, looked at me. "Mr. Gable, do you have a response?" I stood up and walked calmly to the podium at the front of the room. I had no laptop, no PowerPoint. I had a small stack of papers in my hand and Bob's iPhone in my pocket. "Good evening, everyone," I began, my voice even and calm. I let my eyes roam over the faces in the crowd. "Karen's right about one thing. This is about the rules that bind us together. So let's talk about them, shall we?" I set my papers down. Point 1, the tow. I held up a single sheet of paper. "My truck, Bertha, was towed this morning for allegedly being parked for over 4 hours, a violation of Article 9. 4. This is false. This is a printout from my own security camera system, time-stamped, showing my truck was parked on the street for a total of 1 hour and 22 minutes before it was towed. The tow was not just a mistake, it was illegal. Furthermore, I looked to the back of the room. Sal, the tow truck driver, who was kind enough to join us tonight, has provided a signed statement attesting that Miss Pinter pressured him to tow the vehicle immediately, despite his own reservations about the validity of the 4-hour claim. Sal, standing by the door, gave a small, sheepish wave. A murmur went through the room. Karen's face paled slightly. Point 2. The emergency, I continued, moving to my next paper. When I witnessed our HOA president so flagrantly misinterpreting and misusing the bylaws for what appeared to be a personal vendetta, I became genuinely concerned. As a business owner who deals with municipal codes every day, I had to wonder, if she's willing to bend the rules for something so petty, what about something important? What about the safety of our homes and our families? So my company, at no cost to the HOA, undertook a preliminary safety audit of the public works on this block. I paused, letting that sink in. And what we found, I said, my voice dropping to a more serious tone, is that this neighborhood, our neighborhood, has been let down by its leadership. I unrolled a large map of the neighborhood that I'd printed at my office and taped it to the wall behind me. My crews, these men right here, found things. Scary things. I pointed to a spot on the map. Dave's plumbing crew ran a camera down the main sewer line. They discovered a significant route blockage, a ticking time bomb, heading right for number 38, which is Mrs. Higgins' house. I looked at Mrs. Higgins, who was sitting in the front row. The woman who signed the complaint against me. We probably saved you, and the HOA, tens of thousands of dollars in future flood damage and remediation costs. You're welcome. Mrs. Higgins looked horrified. Her husband started whispering furiously in her ear. Furthermore, I went on, pointing to another spot. Sparky's electrical team found 2 streetlights on the main boulevard with dangerously frayed wiring at the base. A clear and present fire hazard. A check of city records shows this same issue was reported twice in the last year, with no action ever taken by the HOA board. The murmur in the room grew louder. People were shifting in their seats, looking at Karen, then back at me. And while my crews were out here, on a Saturday, working for free to identify these issues and make this neighborhood safer for all of us, I said, my voice hardening. Our esteemed president. Well, she wasn't very helpful. I took Bob's phone out of my pocket. Bob, can you help me out here? Bob strode to the front and connected his phone to the projector. The screen, which moments before had shown Karen's neighborhood terrorism slide, now flickered to life with a shaky cell phone video. The room watched in stunned silence as the video played. Karen, screaming at my young employee Timmy, grabbing the landscaping rock and hurling it at my truck. There was a collective gasp. It was undeniable. It was assault on video. And that brings me, I said, as Bob disconnected the phone, to my final point, the sidewalk. I looked over at Enzo, who gave me a subtle nod. That hairline crack in front of my house? It was a trip hazard, another liability the HOA had been notified about and had ignored. I couldn't let it stand, so I did what any concerned citizen would do. I hired a professional, a licensed contractor, to perform an emergency repair to protect the public. I held up the final piece of paper. This is an invoice from Enzo's Masonry for $500 for services rendered. It was submitted to the HOA for payment this afternoon. And, as expected, the HOA, under Miss Pinter's direction, refused to pay it. I gestured to Enzo, who stood up. He was not a large man, but he had a presence. According to state law, Enzo said, his voice quiet but clear. When a contractor is not paid in a timely manner for services rendered to a property, that contractor has the right to place what's called a mechanic's lien against that property. I let the silence hang in the air for a beat before delivering the final blow. And what exactly are the assets of the Serenity Meadows Homeowners Association? I asked the room. This clubhouse, the community pool, the tennis courts, and every single dollar in the HOA bank account. As of 4 p.m. yesterday, when the lien was officially filed with the county clerk's office, all of it is frozen. The room erupted. It was chaos. People were yelling, pointing, standing up. Karen was white as a sheet, her mouth opening and closing but no sound coming out. She looked like a fish gasping for air. Her reign was over, and she knew it. I concluded, my voice rising over the din. You can't spend a cent. Not on your lawyers to sue me, not on the landscapers, not on the pool boy. As of right now, thanks to your president's flagrant disregard for the rules and her refusal to pay a legitimate $500 bill, this HOA is, for all intents and purposes, shut down. That's when Bob, my neighbor, my glorious, flagpole-defending neighbor, climbed up onto a folding chair like a revolutionary leader. I believe we have seen a catastrophic, epic, embarrassing failure of leadership, he boomed, his voice silencing the room. A gross abuse of power, a complete dereliction of duty, and frankly, I'm tired of my flagpole being a legislative issue every other month. I therefore call for a vote of no confidence in the presidency of Karen Pinter. A dozen voices yelled, "Seconded," at once. The vice president, Gerald, looking terrified, stammered, "All in favor of the motion of no confidence?" A thunderous, deafening roar of "Aye" filled the room. It was a landslide. "All opposed," Gerald whispered. Silence. Not even Karen's husband dared to squeak. Karen Pinter had been unceremoniously, brutally, and publicly deposed. Bob wasn't done. Still standing on his chair, he pointed a finger at me. "And now we need an interim president, someone who knows how to fix things, someone who actually gives a damn about the safety and infrastructure of this community. I nominate Frank Gable." The crowd erupted in applause and cheers. My face froze in a mask of pure, unadulterated horror. My stomach dropped. No, 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 no. This was not part of the plan. I started waving my hands frantically. "No, guys, hold on, you don't want me," I pleaded. "I'm a terrible choice. I solve problems with excavators." But it was too late. The chant had already started. "Frank, Frank, Frank!" My carefully orchestrated war of malicious compliance had succeeded beyond my wildest dreams, and my reward was to be crowned king of the very kingdom I had just laid siege to. I was the new, deeply reluctant, and horrified president of the Serenity Meadows HOA. The weeks that followed were a surreal blur. My life became a series of meetings about things I couldn't care less about. I, Frank Gable, a man who finds comfort in the smell of diesel and the hum of a high-powered generator, was now mediating disputes over lawn gnomes. My first act as interim president, passed by unanimous vote in a meeting that lasted 4 minutes, was to amend the bylaws. I took a thick black marker and personally redacted the entire commercial vehicles section. I replaced it with a single sentence. Work trucks are fine, especially cool ones. My second act was to actually fix the problems we'd discovered. I called in my contractor buddies. Dave got the sewer job, Sparky fixed the lights, and Enzo got his $500. I paid them all out of the newly unfrozen HOA funds, and because they were my guys, I got it all done for 20% under the usual rate. I was a fiscal hero. The highlight of my first week was retrieving Bertha. The HOA, under my firm direction, paid the impound fee, the illegal towing fine, and a grievance penalty I completely invented. They also issued a formal, groveling letter of apology, which I immediately had framed and hung on my garage wall right next to my collection of antique wrenches. Life settled into a new, bizarre rhythm. I was a blue-collar king, ruling a white-collar kingdom. I sat at the head of the HOA board meeting table, dressed in my usual work-stained Carhartt jacket, looking utterly miserable as two women, Brenda and Susan, engaged in a 45-minute debate of profound intensity over whether the community garden should feature zucchini or summer squash. "Zucchini is just too prolific," Brenda argued, her voice trembling with passion. "It takes over everything." "But summer squash has a less reliable yield," Susan countered, slamming her hand on the table. "We need to maximize our square footage." I finally just buried my face in my hands. "Fine, plant both," I mumbled. "Half and half, just please stop." They looked at me as if I had solved world hunger. A few weeks after the coup, on a perfect Saturday morning, I was back where I belonged, in my driveway, lovingly polishing the chrome on Bertha's grill. The sun was warm, the birds were singing, and there wasn't an HOA rule book in sight. "Morning, Mr. President." I looked up. Bob was walking over from his yard, holding 2 frosty bottles of beer. He had a massive grin on his face. "Don't start," I groaned, taking the beer he offered. "Just don't. It's been a long week. I had to approve a new color for the petunias at the front gate. It was a 3-hour debate. Petunias, Bob. 3 hours of my life I will never get back. Spent discussing the emotional impact of magenta madness versus periwinkle passion." Bob chuckled and took a long sip of his beer. "Yeah, but my flagpole is safe. The sewer isn't backing up, and the streetlights work. Small price to pay." He leaned in conspiratorially. "Oh, and I saw a moving truck at the Pinter house this morning." I stopped polishing. "You're kidding me? Seriously?" "Yep, packed up and gone. Saw Karen in the front yard yelling at the movers for scuffing the lawn." "Where'd she go?" I asked, a genuine curiosity bubbling up. Bob's grin widened. "Heard they bought a condo downtown, one of those massive new high-rise developments. A friend of mine lives in the building. Says the condo association there is run by a former drill sergeant. They have a 300-page rule book. Apparently you can get fined if your window blinds aren't all angled at exactly 45 degrees. We both looked at each other for a long, silent beat. The image of Karen trying to argue with a man who probably considered her a maggot in a place with even more rules than she could have dreamed of was just perfect. Then we both burst out laughing. It was a deep, hearty, victorious laugh that echoed down the quiet, peaceful street. I took a sip of my beer and looked around. I saw my house, my truck, my quiet, well-maintained, and now surprisingly functional neighborhood. I'd gone to war over a parking spot and had somehow ended up in charge. I was the fox in charge of the henhouse, the bull in the china shop who now owned the shop. I looked at Bertha, gleaming in the sun. It had all been worth it. HOA president, I thought to myself, shaking my head with a smile. Me. The guy who talks to sewer lines for a living. I guess sometimes when you fight the system, you accidentally end up running it. I took another swig of beer. Well, at least I know a guy who can get the job done. And I hear he gives the boss a pretty good deal on emergency repairs.